Mr. Kumar Anil has worked for 29 years in the Bureau of Indian Standards, the national standards body of India in the area of quality control and product conformity certification. Presently, he is working as advisor in the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, the food regulator in India, and heading its standards division. The division is entrusted with the work of formulation of national standards and regulation for food products, which include their quality, safety, and labeling requirements. May I now request Ashish to formally welcome Mr. Kumar Anil with a bouquet. Yeah, Mr. Anil, I was here last year when you talked about the need of upping the bar for the standards in India. It's my pleasure to welcome you on the podium. Please come and deliver the keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of Mr. Agarwal. He wanted to come until 12 today. He was to come, and then suddenly he said that he has some urgent work and he could not come. So my apologies on his behalf. When you were reading my CV, when people read this CV, when I am in some food safety seminars, so I look at other side. People may ask what a chemical engineer is doing in FSSAI and dealing with food safety. But in packaging, I was a bit comfortable because I am a chemical engineer and I have read all this. So this is one forum where I feel comfortable with my degree and my posting. Otherwise, in all food safety seminars, people say, hey, advisor FSSAI is a chemical engineer, not a food technologist. But fortunately, I have a very good team of food technologists with me. My job is to manage them. So I have been doing this for last 3 years. So I'm here. I was here last year also. So thank you very much for inviting me. Many of you may be knowing about Food Safety Authority, but I'll give you a small briefing. Earlier, if you remember, it was Prevention of Food Adulteration Act. So focus was on adulteration. PF Act, it was enacted in 1956, I suppose. And then with that, if you remember, there was one issue of pesticide residue in cola. Report from CSC. There was a lot of hue and cry, and then the JPC was constituted with Honorable Mr. Sharad Pawar. And based on the recommendation of JPC, it was decided to have a uniform, a single authority to look into all aspects of food safety. Earlier, there were milk and milk product order, meat and meat product order, PFA. There were around 9 organizations looking after various aspects of food safety, and especially PFA was not into the food safety as such, they were looking into the adulteration. So with this act, the concept of food adulteration was changed to, you can say, if you look into our act, the mandate of FSSAI is to provide safe, that was the PFA time, and wholesome food. So our mandate was changed from the adulteration to safety and wholesomeness of the food. So we started in, our act is 2006, but our first regulation, first set of 6 regulations came in 2011. I mean, practically speaking, we started functioning from 2011. So we are only a 7-year-old organization. These 6 regulation which came into 2011 includes packaging regulation also. So at that time, the packaging regulation was basically, that is still in force. If you look into the packaging regulation, it was basically a compilation of various BIS standards, mainly BIS standards. It's sort of, you can say it's a compendium of, you can say, BIS standards. So that was our basic initially, which we started with. Then a need was felt that, look, when we started revising this standard, so a need was felt that this claims is something which should be also included in this regulation. We started with this regulation, packaging, labeling, advertisement, and claims. Then at a later stage, it was decided no, claim itself is a big area, and then labeling is also important. So now what we have decided, and we have proceeded in that area, now instead of packaging, labeling, claim, we are having 3 separate regulations. One is on packaging, second is on claims and advertisement and claims, on labeling. So the first 2 regulations, we have already notified. The draft notification was when I was here in the last meeting, we were in the process of issuing the draft notification. Now the draft notification has already been issued on packaging. And we got huge number of comments. We have tried to accommodate all the comments, but I'll not say that we have accommodated everything. No, we have not. And majority of the comments which we have included were basically on, when we started, it was not covering the entire gamut of packaging. Like we got comment on the paper packaging, board, boxes. These type of comments were received. So we had around 3 rounds of discussion within FSSAI where all stakeholders were invited. So after detailed deliberations, we were able to finalize this regulation. And now this, I think, what we feel is very comprehensive, and it's pro-industry, I can say. It's pro-industry because we are safety and wholesomeness of the food is important. Packaging is important from these 2 points of view. But we have tried to include as many types of packaging as possible. Maybe here, majority of you maybe you're from the plastic industry, but we have covered glass, we have covered metal packaging, we have covered box packaging, cardboard, everything we have tried to cover. So it's a very comprehensive standard. And we have already forwarded it to the government, and it can come anytime. But once it is published, so we'll be giving at least 6 months of time. The procedure is, suppose it is published today, so the date of implementation will be 1st of 6 months is mandatory to give. So, and 6 months is mandatory, and date of implementation is always from 1st January or 1st July. So we cannot implement it from 1st January because it will be less than 6 months. So if it is published before 31st of December, it will be 1st July. If we overshoot, if it is not published before 31st of December, then it will be 1st January of 2020. But I'm sure it can come anytime. Maybe August definitely will be able to publish it. And then in that case, it will be implemented from 1st July 2019. So that is all about this regulation. And my colleague Dr. Mishra is here. He'll be talking in detail in the next session about this regulation. And you can, if you have any query, he'll try to resolve it. But still, I feel if you are not satisfied, or if your queries are not resolved, or he is not able to answer on the spot, you are welcome to visit our office anytime, and all details are available. With that, I conclude my this opening remarks, and thank you all for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar Anil, for this little teaser on the upcoming regulations. We all look forward to hearing more about it from your colleagues. With the theme of this session, the role of regulations for safe packaging, I now invite my colleague Jörg Peter Langhammer on the podium for the next speech. This function, he's representing the ink industry's interests across the packaging chain and is in regular contact with relevant legislators on a global level. Currently at SIGWORK, he holds a worldwide responsibility for product safety and industrial safety issues. He's the Vice President, Global HSE and Sustainability with SIGWORK, Germany. Jörg Peter, you're welcome. We'd love to hear about your take on the regulations in more from the international perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imesh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would say, what a crowd. I feel honored to talk to you here. And Yeah, let's directly jump into the presentation, role of regulations for safe packaging. First of all, it would be good to have a look into the regulatory environment on the global scale. Look, this is the globe, and you can easily see all around the globe, if you start in the Americas, North and South America, if you go to Europe, or even go to Asia, there is some kind of food contact material regulation which is existing. However, there are some gaps on ink regulations. When we are talking about inks, we have to assume that inks are ranking amongst the most complex chemical mixtures in food contact materials. I think, Mr. Anil, you would certainly agree. And therefore, there is always an inherent hazard with these inks when printed on food contact materials. And that is why, once upon a time, little Switzerland, in the year 2010, in the heart of Europe, launched an ink regulation. It was the so-called Swiss Ordinance on Packaging Inks. And, well, that started off a multitude of further activities. You see here China popping up. China has explicitly declared to launch a respective regulation by the end of 2019. We see some activities in Indonesia. We have seen this spring an activity for an industry platform called Food Safety Alliance for Packaging in the United States, giving further details also on printing inks. We have heard about India, and we've seen that there is some activities from the Bureau of Indian Standards on the ink standard. We have learned in the past that there is a German draft ink ordinance as well as a planned European printed food contact material regulation activity. And finally, we have to acknowledge that there is Japan, which at the moment has been working based on an exclusion list, which is going to launch a positive list by 2020. So there is actually a chain reaction from what Switzerland has been doing on inks. After having that introduction, let's have a spotlight on the consequences in case food or food contact materials are failing market expectations or are non-compliant. What happens? Well, we see here on that slide a lot of headlines, nasty headlines, which certainly all the brand owners assembled here would not like at all. And also from us, from an ink manufacturer point of view, we would feel extremely bad if we would have been the cause of such nasty headlines. Not to mention, well, the often quoted noodle case here in India, but there have been many other cases around the world, in China, in the United States, recalls, cereal boxes, all the kind of stuff. And I'm honestly of the opinion that regulations would definitely help in objectifying in these scandals and would help to mitigate the consequences. I would like at this very point to quote what I always do, the head of R&D of Nestlé and responsible for quality, Stephen Klump, who says, "It takes years to build trust and fidelity in brands and products, but it takes only seconds or even split of a second to destroy that trust." And I think he is very right. So we have to be very careful. Having said that, I would like to highlight a trend to you which we see in the last, I would say in the last period of time. And this is all around what we call perceived safety. This is what the consumer, the end consumer, perceives as safety. And I just brought you the case which has shocked Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the so-called fipronil case, which is an insecticide used with chicken. And this insecticide has been found in eggs. However, at concentrations which were very, very low. And as usual in these cases, when you would assess the hazard, the consumer would have to take, whatever, 50 eggs per day, and that for a lifelong period in order to come in the range of a hazard, of a health hazard. So there was actually no health hazard. Nevertheless, the consumer refused to take it, and so the eggs had to be wasted. So this is what we call perceived safety, and it is an emotional discussion of the consumers, but it could force retailers and brand owners to immediate reactions and bear of any science. And in such a situation, I think it is even better to have a sound regulation as a reference, because then, of course, opposed to the case where we have no regulation, because an existing regulation at least can try to be a reference point and try to objectify the discussion. So now from perceived safety to another aspect and to another consideration. If you take the share of an ink cost for a brand owner on a branded article, I think we will all agree it's very low, probably below 1. However, if this ink is non-compliant, it is failing compliance, and probably if this ink is contaminating foodstuff, it would lead to a recall and a product concern, and the consequences, the financial consequences of this could be disastrous, and in terms of the cost and the potential damage, this would be completely disproportionate, depending where in the supply chain this would happen. You see that on the right side of the slide, whether it happens in the print shop, would be a detection in a relatively early stage, but if it would be already at the packer filler, the damage would be bigger. If it's in a distribution center, even bigger. And the main disaster is when it comes to recalls from the supermarket shelves. So there the cost impact would be relatively high. And the cost, honestly spoken, for a compliant ink system, probably compliant ink system. I cannot give you default numbers, but let's say it would be 5% more. If you see at the initial price, it would then be 0.15% cost for the brand owner, is relatively low against the damage you can see. Okay, let us ask another question. Are food contact materials in actual use safe by nature? And is any regulatory approach just unnecessary? Of course, it's a provocative question, but let's have a look. What I show you here is the symbols for danger according to the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals. And these 9 symbols all represent specific hazards of chemicals. I can tell you that we immediately could cancel 3 of these hazards. They would never occur at food contact materials. But the remaining 6 ones, they could occur also in food contact materials. And the main message now is, yes, it matters if you carefully select the raw materials and assess their hazards in food contact materials. If you look in detail at the hazards, you could find hazards of materials which are even toxic or very toxic, or which are toxic on a specific organ, and things like that. So really quite important topic to be taken into account. Then the question is, I said, okay, you have to carefully assess those hazards, and once you have done that, you might be ready. You might feel you will be ready. But I have to say that there is one aspect which you have to take into account, which would tell you that once assessed, it is never clear and for the future that this safety assessment remains the same. Why is that? Because global chemicals legislation will continue to put the burden of proof for raw material suppliers of demonstrating safety for their materials. And that means that these raw material suppliers will continue to perform toxicological tests, will continue to submit so-called toxicological dossiers to the authorities. And when these toxicological tests are made, you will find more and more data, sometimes in favor of the material, but also sometimes against the material. So it would mean the hazard would increase. And I've brought to you some proof for that. This is also taken from the inks, from photoinitiators being used in inks. You see here a material called Omnirad 369. The situation before was it was harmless and not classified for human health, and now it is classified with this hazard phrase 360D. That means developmental reprotoxicity, so reprotoxic to the reprotoxic effect, so dangerous for the unborn child. So, is that the only one? No. It came in a row that other materials like PBZ and even more materials like EDB and EHA, all the three being photoinitiators, have undergone the same reclassification. And even those, the last quoted photoinitiators, have even worse toxicological effects, reprotoxic as well, but also damaging fertility. So it's not only dangerous for the pregnant women, but also for men. So that example shows you that you always have to be on the spot. Yeah? When you are in charge of raw material uses for food contact material, you have to carefully have to make your careful choices and have to make your hazard assessments. There's another fact when dealing with raw materials for food contact material, and this is all about purity. In an ideal world, a raw material being purchased and used as a food contact material would be 100% pure. But is it really in reality? We as chemists, could we really say the raw materials being used are 100% pure, really 100%? Of course not. Of course not, because raw materials seldom are 100% pure. They do contain impurities, and even these days when we're talking about food safety and consumer safety, so-called ppm, parts per million levels, do matter. They are important. So, as a person dealing with raw materials, raw material choice for food contact materials, you have to have a detailed knowledge on your raw materials. You have to have transparency on the purity status in order to allow for risk assessment and later for safe uses. I would like to show you a video. I hope it shall work. Oh, it doesn't work. Can you please start it? You just need to click on the yellow surface. Yes, thank you. But we don't have a sound. Okay.
These may be unavoidable residues from the raw materials used, or reaction products, such as can be created in the case of reactive ink systems. Nyas can be transferred from packaging materials to food by migration processes. The extent of this transfer is dependent on various factors. We live up to our responsibility. This is why we pay particular attention both to quality of raw materials used to make our printing inks and maximum transparency in communicating with our customers. Our product-specific SOCs refer to our Nyas risk assessments conducted by experts. This is how we set new standards for accountable action and additional safety within the food packaging supply chain. SIGWORK, we care about ink safety. More information is available on the Ink Safety portal.
So, evidently these impurities I'm talking about are non-intentionally added substances, these Nyases. So you have seen in the video what we are doing in order to ensure further safety and that these NISes are not harming the compliance of our ink systems. In order to give you some more evidence on these NISes, what we are talking about, I show you this slide. You see basically the four main ingredients in an ink: solvents, colorants, binders, additives. And if you look into each category, you will find very interesting representatives of the chemical substances. Most of them you have heard in negative connotation, talking about dioxin and dibenzofuranes, talking about polychlorinated biphenyls, talking about hexachlorobenzene, talking about benzene, talking about toluene, talking about alkyl phenol ethoxylates. All of these could principally be present in a raw material if you do not control properly the supply chain. And I think we all agree that we do not want to see those substances in food stuff and also not in food contact material to an extent that it could harm consumer health. So, what is the conclusion out of that, what I have shown to you? I think hazards and resulting risks, and there is, I think, no doubt, must be eliminated without compromising consumer safety. It must be eliminated. And without doubt, regulations would be the safest way to ensure that, for sure. They could set standards, they could set requirements in order to prevent those nasty materials I have been mentioning to be used. So in this case, regulations can help in eliminating risks. Now let's have another look on what we call the packaging chain. This slide shows you actually the packaging chain as it is. It starts with the raw material suppliers, then you have adhesive ink suppliers, you have printers, converters at the end, you have the packer, the food manufacturer, the brand owner. It's a matter of fact that the burden of proof for the compliance lies at the bottom of the packaging chain with the packer filler and with the brand owner. So the packer filler and the brand owner is put in the problematic situation that he has to rely on the upstream suppliers. And if there would be some block in communication about hazards, about risks, about restrictions, failures and bad surprises, like I've shown to you before with the nasty headlines, could occur. So what is absolutely crucial is transparency along this packaging chain paired with expert-made declarations of conformity, which each partner in this supply chain has to produce and has to give to his next partner in the chain. So that is very important. But the focus lies on expert-made and on transparency. And some of the partners in this packaging chain, if you look, for example, at an ink manufacturer, are in an interesting sandwich position because they have to communicate to both sides, upwards and downwards. So ink manufacturer like Siegwerk has to communicate very openly with the raw material supplier in order to understand what I have been just explaining, and it has to we have to communicate to a printer converter and give him advice about potential restrictions and existing hazards in use. So let's have again a look on regulations. I started with the regulations and I would like to end with regulations. This year, this slide shows you the current state of the art of European food contact material regulations. It's an overview. It all starts with what we call Framework Regulation 1935, which has been produced in the year 2004 and which at the moment in the near future will undergo some revision. However, the basic principles as given in the Article 3 definitely tell you no risky migration, no change in the food composition, and no deterioration of the food. So that both, that both comprises migration of nasty substances, but also odor and taint at the same time. So then we have the so-called good manufacturing practice for printed materials. And then this is followed by different substrate regulations, also as you have been mentioning from the FSSAI. So it's a certain similarity. However, when you have a look at the plastics regulation in Europe, there is a positive list principle. And European authorities have been working more than almost, I would say almost 30 years on these positive lists. And the specific of these positive lists is that they contain evaluated materials which have so-called migration limits, some of which are harmless that they have a global migration limit, but some of them have a certain hazard and therefore they have specific migration limits, which basically a migration limit indicates the level of a concentration of a migrant in the foodstuff which is considered to be harmless if the consumer consumes that foodstuff, that contaminated foodstuff, for a lifelong span. So it's basically a toxicologist's issue. And you will hear about toxicology later on from my colleague. So, and I would like to add in that respect that there's also some guidance notes in the European regulation for the packaging supply chain, how exactly to phrase declarations of conformity, giving all details which are required. This is a very nice guideline for the market partners, and this is basically what we understand by our statement of composition. So, now let's have, apart from this European Food Contact Material Regulation, have a short look on regulations on inks and current activities. Switzerland, as said, the first ever ink regulation on the globe. It's a specific regulation for inks. It only covers indirect food contact, and it has a positive list of 5,000 plus materials, some of them evaluated, carrying so-called migration limits, and the others non-evaluated, having a threshold of concern of 10 ppb. It is, because it has been the first ever appearing ink regulation, the preferred choice of brand owners globally. If you now take a look at Germany, Germany has launched an ink ordinance, a draft ordinance. At the moment, this is in the bottom drawer. It is a national regulation, only valid, principally would be valid in Germany, once implemented. It's not yet implemented. It covers direct, indirect food contact, has also a threshold of concern, has also a positive list principle. And it has been notified, because this is a principle, Germany is part of the European Union, to the European Union, and it has been leading to some requests for change by some European member states. So at the moment, this is in the status of being redrafted. And since the European Union had announced to launch on their side a European regulation, there is basically a kind of race which regulation will make it, the German first or European first. And I cannot tell you here who will make the race, but what I can tell you, definitely we will have such a regulation. So, despite of the fact that it's not yet decided who will make the race, I'm also here to tell you about some latest development on the European side. And I have to mention in that respect what is called a joint industry consortium, the Packaging Joint Industry Task Force, which is a nice forum of industry players, including inks, including substrate manufacturers like paper, board, like plastic, like converters, and like brand owners. And they have worked intensively all together in order to lay out the principles for a future printed food contact material regulation. And I give you some elements of that. So the scope will be direct, indirect food contact inks, positive lists, if existing, would be embedded, but also industry self-risk assessments for new materials. And there will be, of course, a transparent communication along the packaging chain. And they also say all the processes for risk assessment of materials need to be auditable by third parties. So that is basically the latest development on European level. Now, let's have a word on Indian ink standard. As compared and as opposed to the European situation. As the slide shows, there's evidently some kind of incompatibility. Yeah, where is this incompatibility? In the European and Swiss ordinance, this is a mandatory regulation, whilst in the Indian standard it's voluntary. You see also in the scope there are differences. One is in Europe and Switzerland, we have the indirect food contact in the scope. In the Indian standard, it's various applications. But the main difference is that in India there is no positive list existing, it's only an exclusion list, a relatively small one. However, this is going to be reworked. So at the moment, the conclusion is there is no compatibility. So that means if here from an Indian point of view you would plan to export a food contact material to Europe, there might be some hurdles because there's incompatibility in legislation. And I would like to focus in my final slide on those aspects where harmonization is needed for further facilitation of exports. So, first of all, definitions and scope of regulation. That's clear, that needs to be clear. And there needs to be a common understanding of what is really understood by hazardous. What is hazardous? What is there a common understanding between European communities and Indian communities of what is hazardous? Would the globally harmonized system be a, let's say, joint platform? Understanding of risks. Here I'm talking about niaces, about carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic materials, but also mineral oils. Critical applications, food contact, direct food contact, intermediate direct food contact, all that kind of stuff. For the implementation, migration testing methodology, that needs to be also aligned. Risk assessment criteria need to be aligned. Mutual recognition of substance risk assessments would be paramount. Definitions of safe use criteria, would be SMLs acceptable, or not? Thresholds of no concern, would that also be acceptable? And then finally, as said, well, Europe operates at the moment with positive lists. Would that also be a model for India? Or alternative, could India accept self-assessments by industry? And finally, requirements or declarations of conformity, I think, is also paramount, and harmonization should also be done here. So these are all the criteria which need to be clarified in future, and I think we will hear about some update on that. So thank you very much for your attention.